Briarwood Manor had stood for centuries, a towering relic of a bygone era. Its ivy-clad walls and Gothic spires loomed over the surrounding countryside, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. The manor was beautiful, yet there was something about it that sent a chill down the spine, an inexplicable sense of unease that seemed to linger in the air, as if the house itself harbored secrets too dark to be told. When Emily and James inherited Briarwood Manor, they saw only its grandeur, eager to breathe new life into the forgotten estate. But as they settled into their new home, the manor's true nature began to reveal itself. Whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. What began as a dream soon turned into a nightmare, as the couple found themselves drawn deeper into the darkness that lurked within the manor's ancient walls. Now, let's hear the tale of the Mirror of Briarwood Manor. Emily and James stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, staring up at the old mansion that loomed before them. Briarwood Manor was even bigger than they'd imagined, with its tall, pointy towers and dark, ivy-covered walls that seemed to climb endlessly toward the sky. The trees surrounding the estate were thick and ancient, their branches twisting like something out of a fairy tale.
Can you believe it?
James grinned, his eyes sparkling with excitement.
This place is incredible.
Emily nodded, a smile spreading across her face.
It's like something out of a dream,
she said, almost in awe. The house was old, sure, but there was something magical about it, like they'd just stepped into another world.
I can't wait to see inside.
They walked up the cracked stone steps to the massive front doors. The wood was old and weathered, and the brass handles were worn from years of use. With a little push, James swung one of the doors open, and it creaked loudly as it moved. Inside, the air was cool and smelled a bit like dust and old wood. The foyer was huge, with a grand staircase leading up to the second floor. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and the floors were polished, but covered in a thin layer of dust. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, casting bright, warm patches on the floor.
Wow.
Emily whispered, stepping inside.
It's even more amazing than I thought.
James turned to her with a grin.
We're going to have so much fun fixing this place up.
He was already moving ahead, eager to explore the rest of the house. Emily followed, her excitement building with each step. They peeked into rooms filled with old furniture, walked down long hallways that seemed to go on forever, and imagined what the house must have been like when it was first built.
Look at this.
James called from a hallway off the main foyer. Emily hurried over to find him standing in front of a huge, ornate mirror, hanging on the wall. The frame was gilded and carved with intricate designs, and the glass was cloudy from age.
This is incredible,
Emily said, running her fingers along the edge of the frame.
I wonder how old it is.
Who knows?
James said, peering into the glass.
But it's definitely staying.
Emily laughed.
As if we could move it. It probably weighs a ton.
They both chuckled, sharing a moment of excitement over their new adventure. The manor felt like it was full of possibilities, and they couldn't wait to make it their own. As they continued exploring, neither of them noticed the faint shadow that flickered in the mirror, dark and fleeting, like a whisper in the back of their minds. Emily and James had spent the better part of the morning unpacking and exploring more of Briarwood Manor. The house was vast, with corridors that twisted and turned, leading to rooms filled with dust-covered furniture and forgotten memories. The thrill of discovery was still fresh, and the couple moved through the house with a sense of purpose, eager to turn the old mansion into their dream home. As they worked, the mirror they'd discovered in the hallway remained on their minds. It was impossible to ignore. Its presence seemed to dominate the space, even when they weren't near it. There was something about it, something they couldn't quite put their fingers on that made it feel like more than just a piece of old furniture.
Is it just me, or does this place seem bigger than it did yesterday?
James asked, wiping sweat from his brow as he carried a box into the dining room. Emily laughed, though there was a touch of nervousness in her voice.
I know what you mean. It's like the house keeps going and going.
They had spent the morning clearing out some of the rooms and deciding where to start with the renovations. There was so much potential here, but it was going to take a lot of work. Still, they were excited about the possibilities. But as the day wore on, Emily found her thoughts drifting back to the mirror. She couldn't explain it, but it was like it was calling to her, drawing her back to that dark hallway. Every time she passed by, she felt compelled to stop and look into the cloudy glass, as if it held some secret just waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't long before she found herself standing in front of it again. The gilded frame seemed to glow softly in the dim light, and as she peered into the glass, she saw her reflection, slightly distorted by the age of the mirror.
Emily, you okay?
James's voice snapped her out of her trance, and she realized she'd been staring into the mirror for who knows how long.
Yeah, I'm fine.
She said, shaking her head as if to clear it.
I was just thinking.
James smiled as he joined her in front of the mirror.
It's something, isn't it? Almost like it's alive.
Emily chuckled, though the thought sent a shiver down her spine.
Yeah, almost. It's just so mesmerizing.
They both stood there for a moment longer, gazing into the mirror. The room seemed colder now, and the shadows that danced on the edges of the glass felt more pronounced. But neither of them wanted to look away. Finally, James broke the silence.
We should get back to work,
he said, though he sounded reluctant to leave. Emily nodded, tearing her gaze from the mirror.
Yeah, you're right. We have a lot to do.
As they walked away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching them, its presence lingering in her mind like a faint whisper. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the renovations, but the thought of the mirror kept creeping back in. And behind them, in the dim hallway, the mirror stood silent and still, its cloudy surface reflecting nothing but shadows. After a long day of unpacking and clearing out rooms, Emily and James decided to take a break. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow through the windows and adding a warm hue to the dusty old mansion. They sat down on a couple of worn-out chairs they had found in one of the rooms, enjoying the silence and the sense of accomplishment.
Can you believe how much we got done today?
James said, a satisfied grin on his face.
I know.
Emily replied, stretching her legs.
It's starting to feel like hours, isn't it?
James nodded.
Yeah, it really is. There's still a lot to do, but I'm excited. This place has so much potential.
Emily smiled, but as the light continued to fade, her thoughts drifted back to the mirror. It had been at the back of her mind all day, like a persistent whisper she couldn't quite shake. Even now, as she sat there with James, she felt an almost magnetic pull drawing her back to that dark hallway.
Do you want to take another look at the mirror?
Emily asked, the words escaping her before she could think them through. James looked at her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes.
The mirror? Sure, why not?
They got up and walked back down the twisting corridors, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The mansion was quiet now, almost too quiet, and as they approached the hallway where the mirror hung, Emily felt that familiar sense of unease creeping back in. The mirror was just as they had left it, massive, ornate, and slightly cloudy from age. But there was something different about it now, something Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. It seemed to almost hum with energy, like it was waiting for them.
Have you ever seen a mirror like this before?
James asked, running his fingers along the gilded frame.
Never.
Emily said softly. She was standing in front of it now, staring into the glass. Her reflection seemed off, like it was moving just a fraction of a second behind her.
It's strange, isn't it?
James nodded, but his attention was already drifting.
Yeah, but it's cool. It's like it belongs here.
Emily didn't respond. She was too focused on the mirror. The longer she stared, the more she felt like she was falling into it, like the mirror was pulling her in. The room around her seemed to fade, and all she could see was the mirror, its cloudy surface swirling with shadows.
Emily?
James's voice cut through the fog, and she blinked, snapping back to reality.
Sorry,
She said, shaking her head.
I don't know what's gotten into me.
It's just an old mirror.
James said, though his voice lacked the confidence it usually held.
Come on, let's get back to work.
But as they walked away, the mirror remained on Emily's mind, its pull stronger than ever. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like the mirror was trying to tell her something, like it was holding a secret just beneath the surface. And deep down, she knew that she would have to uncover that secret, no matter what it took. The couple returned to their work, but the atmosphere in the house had changed. The excitement of the morning had faded, replaced by a quiet tension that neither of them could shake. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, the mirror remained, watching them, waiting. As the last light of day faded, Emily and James finished up their work, the rooms they had cleared now echoing with the sounds of settling dust and creaking floorboards. The manor, which had felt almost welcoming in the daylight, now seemed to shift in the growing darkness. Shadows stretched longer, and the air felt cooler, heavier, as if the house itself was preparing for the night. After a quick dinner, they retired to one of the few rooms they had managed to set up, a small, cozy bedroom near the back of the house. The bed, though old, was sturdy enough, and they had brought their own linens to make it feel more like home. Emily and James settled in, exhaustion from the day's work beginning to take its toll. The stillness of the manor was a stark contrast to the bustling activity of the day, and soon the only sound was the soft hum of the wind outside. But as Emily lay in bed, her thoughts wandered back to the mirror. The image of it lingered in her mind, as if etched into her memory. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching them, even from down the hall. The way it had drawn her in, the way her reflection had seemed wrong. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, no matter how tired she was. The night wore on, and the silence of the manor deepened. The only light came from a small lamp they had placed on the bedside table, casting a warm, dim glow across the room. But even that small comfort couldn't keep the darkness at bay. Emily's eyes flickered open, sleep eluding her as a faint sound caught her attention. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened closer, she realized it was something else, something inside the house. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the soft shuffle of footsteps on a distant floor. Her heart began to race, the familiar unease creeping back in. The sound grew louder, closer, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced over at James, who was fast asleep, unaware of the growing tension. Emily sat up slowly, straining to hear. The footsteps seemed to pause, and then there was a faint creak, as if a door was being opened somewhere in the house. She held her breath, her eyes darting to the bedroom door. It was closed, but the hallway beyond it seemed to stretch endlessly in her mind, leading back to the mirror, back to the shadows that had danced across its surface. The mirror was calling to her, its presence like a dark whisper in the back of her mind. Emily tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just the house settling, just the wind playing tricks on her ears. But the sound persisted, a low, steady creak that seemed to echo through the very walls of the manor. It was coming from the hallway, from the direction of the mirror. Unable to resist, Emily slipped out of bed, careful not to wake James. The floor was cold beneath her feet as she crept toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she turned it, opening the door just a crack. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lamp in their room. But even in the dim light, she could see it, the mirror, standing at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. The air seemed to thicken as she stepped out into the hall, drawn toward the mirror by a force she couldn't explain. As she approached, the creaking sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just footsteps. It was something moving within the house, something that shouldn't be there. The mirror's surface, once cloudy, now seemed clearer, almost like it was reflecting something that wasn't there before. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared into the glass. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't her own. It was dark, distorted, like a shadow of herself, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The figure in the mirror seemed to shift, moving closer, as if trying to reach out to her from within the glass. A cold dread washed over her, and she stumbled back, the spell broken. She could feel the presence of the mirror, its pull stronger than ever, but she knew she couldn't stay there. She had to get away, had to go back to James, back to the safety of their room. She turned and hurried back down the hall, her footsteps quick and silent on the wooden floor. Creaking sound followed her, echoing through the darkness, but she didn't look back. She couldn't look back. When she finally reached the bedroom, she closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. The room was warm, safe, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like the mirror's gaze was still on her. Emily climbed back into bed, her body trembling as she pulled the covers up to her chin. She didn't wake James, didn't tell him what she had seen. But as she lay there in the dark, her eyes wide open, she knew that something was terribly wrong with Briarwood Manor. And it all led back to the mirror. The next morning, Emily awoke to the soft light of dawn, filtering through the curtains. For a moment, she felt disoriented, the events of the previous night lingering in her mind like a fading nightmare. She lay still, listening to the quiet of the house, half expecting to hear the creaking footsteps again. But the manor was silent, and the only sound was James's steady breathing beside her. Emily tried to shake off the unease that had settled over her. It was just a dream, she told herself. But as she got out of bed and began her morning routine, the feeling of being watched never quite left her. James, oblivious to Emily's troubled thoughts, was already in high spirits, eager to get back to work.
Another day, another room to tackle,
He said with a grin, as they ate breakfast in the small kitchen they'd managed to clear out.
We're really making progress.
Emily forced a smile, not wanting to dampen his enthusiasm.
Yeah, we are.
She agreed, though her mind was elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mirror, the shadowy figure in its depths, the gleaming eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. As they set to work on the next room, a small study near the front of the house, Emily couldn't help but glance down the hallway where the mirror hung. The door to the room was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. But she resisted the urge to go near it, focusing instead on the task at hand. Hours passed, and the day wore on. The study was filled with old books, most of them covered in dust and long forgotten. Emily found herself sifting through them, her mind only half on the work. The books were heavy, their pages yellowed with age, and as she flipped through them, she felt a strange sense of connection, like she was uncovering secrets that had been buried for years. But the further she delved into the past, the more her unease grew. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, the air thickening with each passing moment. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching her every move. James, ever the optimist, remained cheerful as he worked.
This place has so much history,
He said, wiping sweat from his brow as he stacked another pile of books.
Can you imagine the stories these walls could tell?
Emily nodded absently, her thoughts far from the present. The mirror's pull was growing stronger, its presence a constant weight on her mind. It was as if the house was trying to draw her back to it, to show her something she wasn't ready to see. The afternoon sun began to wane. casting long shadows across the floor. The study, once filled with light, now felt cold and oppressive. Emily's heart raced as she realized she'd been unconsciously moving toward the door, toward the hallway where the mirror waited. She stopped herself just in time, shaking her head as if to clear it.
I need some fresh air.
She said abruptly, not waiting for James to respond as she hurried out of the study. Cool breeze outside was a welcome relief, and Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The manor loomed behind her, its dark windows like eyes watching her every move. She walked around the garden, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path, but even here, she couldn't escape the feeling of being followed. She glanced back at the house, half expecting to see the shadowy figure in one of the windows, but there was nothing. Just the old, silent mansion, standing tall and foreboding against the darkening sky. Emily's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door creaking open behind her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, but it was only James, stepping out onto the steps.
You okay?
He called, concern flickering in his eyes.
I'm fine.
She replied, forcing another smile.
Just needed a break.
James nodded, but he didn't look convinced.
Let's call it a day. It's starting to get dark, and there will be plenty to do tomorrow.
He suggested.
We've done enough for now.
Emily agreed, relieved to be away from the study, away from the mirror. But as they headed back inside, the sense of unease followed her, clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. As night fell once again, Emily couldn't help but feel that the house was closing in on them, the walls whispering secrets she wasn't ready to hear. The mirror's influence was growing stronger, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it would pull her back, deeper into the darkness that lurked within Briarwood Manor. As the days passed, the excitement that had once filled Briarwood Manor began to fade. The house, which had felt like a grand adventure, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The rooms they had so eagerly explored now felt darker, the once charming quirks of the old mansion now unsettling. Emily and James continued their work, but there was a subtle shift in their routines. The house seemed to creak more often, the shadows stretching longer as the days grew shorter. Emily found herself avoiding certain parts of the house, particularly the hallway where the mirror hung. It wasn't a conscious decision, more of a quiet instinct. One evening, after a long day of clearing out a particularly cluttered room, Emily sat by the window, looking out at the garden. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the overgrown hedges and wildflowers. It should have been peaceful, but all she could think about was the mirror.
It's strange, isn't it?
She murmured, half to herself. James, who was organizing some of the old books they had found, looked up.
What is?
He asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp with curiosity.
The way this house feels different at night.
Emily said, turning to face him.
During the day, it's just an old, creaky place. But when the sun goes down...
Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. James hesitated, then nodded.
Yeah, I've noticed it too. It's like the house is more alive at night. But it's just the atmosphere, right? An old place like this, with all its history, it's bound to feel a little spooky.
Emily smiled, appreciating his attempt to lighten the mood, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken root in her chest.
I suppose so.
She said, though her voice lacked conviction as she remembered the things she had seen and heard. There was still a part of her that thought it could just be her imagination. That night, after they had retired to their bedroom, the house settled into its familiar nocturnal rhythm. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and the old beams creaked as they shifted in the cool night air. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, it was just the usual sounds, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the hours dragged on, a new sound emerged, faint but distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway where the mirror hung. Emily's heart began to race, the uneasy feeling from earlier intensifying. She turned her head slightly, glancing at the closed bedroom door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it seemed they were right outside the door. She held her breath, straining to hear more. James shifted beside her, his breathing even and deep. He was still asleep, oblivious to the tension that had gripped her. Emily wanted to wake him, to tell him what she was hearing, but something stopped her, an irrational fear that speaking would somehow draw whatever was out there closer. The footsteps paused, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Emily let out a shaky breath, willing herself to calm down. But just as she began to relax, the footsteps resumed, moving away this time, back down the hallway. Emily lay still, her mind racing. The sound had been so real, so deliberate, like someone was pacing the corridor just outside their door. She knew she should check, but the thought of opening the door, of seeing what might be there, was too much. In the morning, the memory of the footsteps lingered, a ghost of the night before. James, unaware of what had transpired, was his usual upbeat self, diving into the day's work with renewed energy. Emily tried to match his enthusiasm, but the unease from the night before clung to her like a shadow. As they worked through the day, Emily found herself glancing toward the hallway more often, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, watching her. But the mirror remained as it always had, silent and still, reflecting nothing but the dusty walls and the dim light filtering through the windows. The day dragged on, and as evening approached, the house began to take on its familiar, unsettling aura. Emily couldn't help but feel that something was different, that the mirror was somehow connected to the strange occurrences. But how could she explain that to James without sounding ridiculous? As they sat down to dinner, Emily finally spoke up.
James, have you noticed anything odd about the mirror?
James looked at her, a forkful of food paused halfway to his mouth.
Odd? Like what?
I don't know.
Emily said, shaking her head.
It just feels off, like it's watching us.
James smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes.
It's just a mirror, Em. Maybe we're just tired, letting this old house get to us.
Maybe.
Emily conceded, though deep down she knew it was more than that. As night fell once again, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something in the house had begun to wake up. The mirror's presence loomed larger than ever in her mind, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. And as they prepared for bed, Emily knew that the night ahead would bring no comfort, only more questions, questions she was too afraid to ask, but knew she couldn't avoid forever. The next morning, Emily awoke feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed. The night had been restless, filled with half-remembered dreams and the lingering sense of being watched. She didn't mention the footsteps to James, not wanting to alarm him or add to the growing tension between them. As they prepared breakfast, the air between them was heavy with unspoken worries. Emily tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the mirror and the strange sensations that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. The day ahead promised more work, more attempts to turn the old mansion into a home, but the weight of the previous night was hard to shake. James, however, seemed determined to press on. He moved through the house with purpose, his usual enthusiasm dimmed, but not extinguished.
Let's tackle some other rooms today,
he suggested, his voice betraying a hint of fatigue.
We haven't touched them yet, and who knows what we'll find?
Emily nodded, agreeing silently as they made their way to the other rooms. The hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that led to rooms long forgotten. As they approached the end of the corridor, the mirror came into view, its presence unavoidable. James glanced at it, his expression unreadable.
You know, I didn't sleep all that well last night,
he said, breaking the silence.
Kept hearing strange noises. Maybe it's just this place getting under my skin.
Emily hesitated, then spoke softly.
It's not just you. I heard them too.
James looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes.
You did?
She nodded.
Footsteps, right outside the door. I thought I was imagining it.
James frowned, his gaze shifting back to the mirror.
Maybe it's just the house settling or the wind. This place is old after all.
But even as he said it, there was doubt in his voice. The mirror seemed to draw his attention, as if it held some secret he was trying to decipher. He took a step closer to it, his reflection slightly in the cloudy glass. The morning passed in a blur of work, but Emily couldn't help but notice that James's attention kept drifting back to the mirror. He would stop, mid-task, and glance down the hallway, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. At one point, while they were clearing out an old bedroom, Emily heard a sharp intake of breath from James. She turned to see him standing perfectly still, his eyes wide, staring at the mirror from across the room.
James?
She called softly, concern tightening her chest. He blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and turned to her.
I thought I saw something in the mirror, but it's gone now,
he said, his voice shaky. Emily's heart skipped a beat.
What did you see?
I don't know.
James admitted, running a hand through his hair.
It was just a shadow, I think, but it didn't feel right.
The rest of the day passed, uneventfully, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. James was quieter, more introspective, as if he were turning something over in his mind. Emily could see the change in him, the way he moved through the house with a new wariness, like he was no longer certain of what he might find. That night, after they had finished their work and settled into bed, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Emily could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself rigid, as if trying to fend off the creeping fear that had taken root in both of them. The house was quiet, the darkness pressing in around them. But sleep did not come easily. Just as Emily began to drift off, she heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. This time, she wasn't alone in her fear. James sat up, his eyes wide as the sound grew louder, closer.
Do you hear that?
He whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps stopped just outside their door, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, with a creak, the door handle began to turn, ever so slowly. James moved to get out of bed, but as soon as he did, the handle snapped back, the door rattling in its frame as if something had been forcefully pushed away. The sound echoed through the house, and James froze, his breath caught in his throat. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, fading into the distance, leaving them in stunned silence. James looked at Emily, his face pale, fear clear in his eyes.
There's something in this house,
he whispered, finally admitting what they had both been avoiding. Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers, trying to steady them both.
I know. I felt it too,
she said softly, her voice trembling. For the first time, they both understood that the presence in the house was real, something far beyond their understanding. The mirror, the footsteps, the shadows, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to reveal itself, but not in any way they could have imagined. As they lay back down, sleep eluded them both. The darkness seemed to close in, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing. And in the hallway, the mirror waited, its surface cold and still, hiding the secrets of Briarwood Manor within its depths. The days at Briarwood Manor had taken on a new, terrifying rhythm. The unsettling occurrences they both experienced were no longer isolated incidents. Each day, the house seemed to twist further into a dark reflection of itself, as if the very walls were closing in around them. The mirror was at the center of it all, its influence growing stronger, drawing them deeper into its grasp. It began with another sleepless night. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house oppressive, suffocating. The faint creaks and groans of the old mansion had become more than just the sounds of settling wood. They were now the footsteps of something unseen, something that moved with intent through the darkened halls. James was restless beside her, tossing and turning, his sleep disturbed by the same unseen forces. He had grown quieter over the past few days, his usual optimism eroded by the creeping dread that now hung over them like a shadow. The mirror haunted his thoughts, as it did Emily's, its presence a constant weight on their minds. One evening, as they worked in silence, the mirror's pull became impossible to ignore. Emily was in the study, trying to distract herself by organizing the old books they had found, when she heard a loud crash from the hallway. Her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to see what had happened. In the hallway, she found James standing in front of the mirror, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. A small table that had been sitting near the mirror was overturned. The vase that had rested on it shattered on the floor, water and glass scattered across the wood. But it wasn't the broken vase that held her attention. It was the mirror. The shadows within the glass seemed darker, more defined, swirling in a slow, deliberate dance. Emily could feel the mirror's pull, stronger than ever, a force that seemed to tug at the very core of her being.
James?
She whispered, her voice trembling.
What happened?
He didn't answer right away, his gaze locked on the mirror. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, distant.
I saw something in the mirror. It was there, just for a moment. A shadow, moving. But it wasn't me.
Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to him, her eyes flicking to the mirror's surface. The reflection that stared back at them was their own, but there was something wrong with it, something in the way the shadows clung to their images, distorting them just enough to make them seem off. The air around them grew colder, the shadows in the hallway lengthening as if the light itself was being drained away. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, a cold dread settling in her stomach. They both took a step back from the mirror, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The mirror wasn't just reflecting their images, it was reflecting something else, something dark and malevolent that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. Suddenly, the mirror's glass rippled, as though it were liquid instead of solid. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched the shadows in the mirror swirl faster, taking shape. A face, a twisted, anguished face, pressed against the glass from the other side, its eyes gleaming with a cold, unnatural light. James reached out instinctively, his hand trembling as it hovered just above the surface of the mirror. But before he could touch it, the mirror let out a deep, resonant thud, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. The sound reverberated through the hallway, sending vibrations through the floorboards and up into their bones. Emily screamed, grabbing James's arm and pulling him back just as the mirror's surface seemed to bulge outward, as if something was trying to force its way through. The shadows writhed in the glass, their movements frantic and violent as the mirror pulsed with dark energy.
James, we have to get out of here.
Emily shouted, panic rising in her throat. They turned and ran toward the front door, their footsteps echoing through the mansion as the mirror's ominous presence loomed behind them. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, the house seeming to close in around them with every step they took. When they reached the front door, James grabbed the handle and twisted, but the door wouldn't budge. He tried again, throwing his weight against it, but it was as if the door had fused with the frame, immovable.
Emily, it won't open?
James's voice was filled with desperation as he pounded on the door. Emily tried the windows, her hands shaking as she struggled to lift the old heavy panes. They too were stuck, as if welded shut by some invisible force. The entire house seemed to have turned against them, trapping them inside. They rushed to the back door, then the side door, trying every exit they could find, but each one was the same, sealed tight, refusing to let them out. The walls seemed to press closer, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The mirror's pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. They could feel its presence even from across the house, a dark force that seemed to be drawing them back, pulling them deeper into its grasp.
James, what do we do?
Emily's voice was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. James looked around, panic flickering in his eyes.
We have to find another way out. There has to be another way.
But deep down, they both knew the truth. The house wasn't going to let them leave. The mirror wasn't going to let them leave. As they stood there, trapped in the darkened hallway, the full weight of their situation settled over them. The mirror's influence had seeped into every corner of the house, its dark tendrils wrapping around them, holding them fast. And as the night deepened, the shadows within the mirror continued to swirl, waiting for the moment when they would finally be drawn in, when there would be no escape. Emily and James stood in the dimly lit hallway, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they stared at the front door, which had refused to budge. The oppressive silence of the house seemed to press in on them from all sides, and the air was thick with the unmistakable feeling of being trapped. The mirror's dark influence was suffocating, and they could feel it reaching out, tightening its grip. As they stood frozen, trying to comprehend their situation, something shifted in the corner of Emily's vision. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw at the shadows from the mirror, thick and inky, creeping along the floor. They moved with a sinister purpose, slithering across the polished wood like living entities, stretching and twisting as they approached. The shadows were dark and unnatural, deeper than any darkness she had ever seen, as if they were absorbing the very light around them.
James,
Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear.
the shadows, they're moving.
James followed her gaze, his face draining of color as he saw the dark tendrils creeping toward them. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, reaching out, drawing closer with each passing second. They had no time to react before the shadows began to spread, seeping from the edges of the hallway, crawling out from under the doors, and slipping through the cracks in the walls. They were surrounded, the darkness pressing in from all sides, leaving them with only one path forward.
We need to move now.
James urged, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the stairs. They turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the silent mansion as they raced toward the staircase. The shadows were relentless, pooling at the base of the stairs, growing thicker and darker, cutting off any chance of retreat. Emily could feel the cold breath of the shadows on her heels, the darkness tugging at her, trying to pull her down. She stumbled on the first step, her legs trembling, but James caught her, pulling her up as they ascended the stairs. The shadows continued to swell, climbing the walls, reaching out for them with dark, tendril-like fingers. The air was frigid, the cold seeping into their bones as they scrambled up the stairs, desperate to stay ahead of the creeping darkness. They reached the top of the stairs, but the shadows were relentless, climbing after them, the darkness spreading up the walls like a living thing. The only light left in the house was the faint, eerie glow from the moon outside, casting long, ghostly beams through the windows. But even that seemed to be dimming as the shadows grew stronger. James pulled Emily into the first room they reached, slamming the door shut behind them. But even as they stood there, gasping for breath, they could see the shadows seeping under the door, the darkness pressing against the wood as if trying to force its way inside. The shadows moved slower now, as though the solid barrier was impeding their progress, but they were still relentless, inching forward with malevolent intent. Emily glanced back, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the shadows swirling at the foot of the staircase, forming into grotesque shapes, faces twisted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. The mirror's influence was growing stronger, and the shadows were now more than just dark smudges on the floor. They were manifestations of something much darker, something that sought to consume them.
We need to block the door.
Emily cried, her voice trembling with fear. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the large, heavy wardrobe in the corner.
Help me move this.
James nodded, rushing to her side as they pushed against the wardrobe, straining to move the massive piece of furniture. The wood groaned under the pressure, but it barely budged, too heavy for them to shift quickly. As they pushed, James noticed something strange. The wardrobe shifted slightly, revealing a small gap behind it, a loose panel in the wall. He paused as he reached out to touch the panel.
Emily, look at this.
Emily stopped, peering behind the wardrobe with wide eyes. The panel was loose, revealing a narrow gap that led into darkness.
A hidden passage.
She breathed.
Maybe it's a way out.
They exchanged a quick glance, knowing they had no other choice. The shadows were still advancing, seeping under the door in slow, creeping tendrils. They wouldn't have much time.
Come on.
James urged, motioning for Emily to follow as he squeezed into the narrow passage behind the wardrobe. The passage was tight, the walls pressing in on them from both sides, covered in years of dust and cobwebs. The air was thick and stale, but there was a faint draft that suggested it led somewhere higher, deeper into the house. As they moved through the passage, the shadows reached the base of the door, but they hesitated, as if unsure whether to follow. The darkness seemed to writhe, agitated but reluctant to enter the narrow space. It was as if the attic beyond the passage held something they feared or couldn't control. The passage wound upward, the floor slanting steeply as they climbed higher into the mansion. Cold air seemed to grow colder, biting into their skin as they ascended. Emily's heart pounded with fear and anticipation, each step taking them closer to an unknown fate. Finally, the passage opened into a small, dimly lit attic space. The room was cluttered with old, forgotten objects, dusty trunks, faded furniture, and stacks of yellowed papers. The only light came from a small, round window at the far end of the attic, its glass cracked and dirty, but allowing just enough moonlight to cast eerie shadows across the floor. Emily and James collapsed onto the floor, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The attic was silent, the air heavy with the weight of decades of neglect. But as they caught their breath, they realized that the shadows had not followed them. The darkness seemed to hover at the entrance to the passage, as if afraid to enter the attic. James stood up, his legs shaky as he moved to the window, peering out into the night. The manor loomed dark and silent around them, but there was a sense of reprieve in the attic, a small moment of safety in the midst of the growing terror.
What is it about this place?
Emily whispered, her voice trembling.
Why didn't the shadows follow us?
James shook his head, his brow furrowed in thought.
I don't know, but whatever it is, it's giving us time. We need to figure out what's happening, why the mirror is doing this.
Emily nodded, but her thoughts were already racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that had become their lives. The attic offered them a brief respite, but they knew the mirror's power was still growing, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way to reach them. As they sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of a forgotten past, Emily felt a cold chill run down her spine. The mirror's influence was far from over, and the shadows were still lurking, waiting for the moment when they could strike again. For now, the attic was their sanctuary, but Emily knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The mirror would find them, and when it did, they would have to face whatever darkness lay within its depths. The attic was a maze of forgotten memories, filled with dust-covered trunks, ancient furniture, and stacks of yellowed papers that had long been untouched by human hands. The air was thick with the scent of age and neglect, a musty odor that clung to the walls and floors like a shroud. Before Emily and James, the attic offered a small reprieve from the terror that had chased them through the house, a brief moment of safety in an otherwise relentless nightmare. They had been sitting in silence, catching their breath, when Emily's gaze fell on a small, ornate chest tucked into the far corner of the attic. The chest was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light, the wood polished and well-preserved despite the dust that covered it.
James,
She whispered, pointing to the chest.
look at that.
James followed her gaze, curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. Together, they approached the chest, the old floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Emily reached out, brushing the dust away from the lid before carefully lifting it open. Inside, nestled among layers of old, delicate fabric, was a thick, leather-bound book and a small, crystal stone that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The book looked ancient, its cover worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Crystal stone, by contrast, was pristine, glowing with an ethereal light that seemed to pulse softly as Emily touched it.
What is this?
James murmured, carefully lifting the book from the chest. He held it in his hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the sense of history that clung to its pages. Emily picked up the crystal stone, marveling at the way it seemed to catch the light, refracting it in strange, shifting patterns.
It's beautiful.
She whispered, feeling a strange warmth emanating from the stone, as if it were alive with some kind of energy. James opened the book, flipping through the brittle pages with care. The text was handwritten in an elegant script, but the language was old, almost archaic, and difficult to decipher. As he turned the pages, he began to piece together the story it told, a dark tale of power, betrayal, and a terrible curse.
This book, it's about the mirror.
James said, his voice hushed with awe and dread.
It says that a long time ago, something dark was locked away inside the mirror. A creature or a spirit, bound to do the bidding of the one who trapped it there.
Emily's eyes widened as she listened, her fingers tightening around the crystal stone.
A spirit? But why? Why trap something like that in a mirror?
James continued to read, his brow furrowing as he struggled to understand the ancient text.
The one who trapped it. He bound the spirit to the mirror to use its power for his own gain. But the spirit was strong, too strong, and it began to grow more powerful over time, feeding on the fears and desires of those who looked into the mirror.
Emily shivered, the cold air of the attic seeping into her bones.
So the spirit, it's what's been haunting us? It's what's been trying to break free?
James nodded grimly.
Yes. The book says that if the spirit ever grew too powerful, it could only be destroyed by shattering the mirror with the crystal stone used to seal it there in the first place. This stone,
He said, pointing at the crystal for emphasis. Emily stared at the stone in her hand, feeling the weight of its significance.
So, we have to break the mirror? That's the only way to stop this.
yes,
James said, his voice filled with determination.
we have to shatter the mirror with the stone. It's the only way to destroy the spirit and break the curse.
As they stood there, the full gravity of their situation began to sink in. The mirror wasn't just a haunted object. It was a prison for something ancient and malevolent, a creature that had been biding its time, growing stronger with each passing day. And now, with the mirror's power at its peak, the creature was on the verge of breaking free. The attic felt colder, darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in around them. But within the darkness, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to end the nightmare that had taken hold of their lives. Emily looked at James, her eyes filled with resolve.
We have to do this, James. We have to destroy the mirror before it's too late.
James nodded, his jaw set with determination.
We will, but we have to be careful. The spirit won't let us do this easily.
The house seemed to groan in response, the old wood creaking under the weight of the dark power that pulsed through it. The shadows outside the passageway lingered, as if aware of the couple's plan, waiting for the moment when they would make their move. But Emily and James were ready. With the crystal stone in hand and the knowledge they had gained from the book, they knew what they had to do. The final confrontation with the mirror was imminent, and this time they would be prepared. With the crystal stone clutched tightly in James's hand and the ancient book's instructions etched into their minds, Emily and James prepared for the perilous journey back down to the mirror. The attic had provided them with the knowledge they needed, but they knew the most dangerous part of their ordeal still lay ahead. The passageway that had once seemed like a refuge now felt like a narrow tunnel of doom. As they descended, the darkness pressed in from all sides, the air thick with the sense of imminent danger. The shadows, which had hesitated at the threshold of the attic, now seemed emboldened, creeping closer with every step they took. Emily held onto James's arm, her heart pounding as they moved cautiously through the narrow corridor. The light from the crystal stone flickered, its glow barely strong enough to push back the encroaching darkness. The shadows writhed along the walls, stretching and twisting, reaching out with inky tendrils that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. They emerged from the passageway into the second-floor hallway, but the house had changed. The familiar layout had been distorted. The walls seemed to shift and twist, the furniture rearranged into a chaotic maze designed to disorient them. The shadows surged forward, weaving through the corridors, manipulating the rooms around them, blocking their path and trying to confuse them.
"Stay close,"
James whispered, his voice tense as he led the way. He kept the crystal stone held high, its dim light the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. But the stone's power was weakening. The shadows were stronger now, their dark tendrils curling just inches away from their bodies, waiting for any misstep. Emily could feel the house shifting around them, the walls seeming to close in, the furniture looming like sinister obstacles in their path. Every step felt like a gamble, every breath a struggle against the suffocating darkness that pressed down on them from all sides. The shadows were relentless, slithering along the floor, reaching for their ankles, tugging at their clothes, trying to pull them into the void.
James, we're almost there.
Emily urged, her voice trembling. She could see the faint outline of the hallway where the mirror awaited them, the darkness thick and impenetrable, the shadows swirling with greater intensity. As they drew closer to the mirror's room, the shadows seemed to gather their strength, their movements growing more aggressive, more coordinated. The darkness pressed in tighter, the stone's light flickering dangerously as it struggled to hold them back. Suddenly, a piece of furniture, a heavy armchair, lurched into their path, forcing them to swerve. Emily stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of a rug, and the shadows surged forward, seizing the opportunity. A dark tendril shot out, wrapping around her ankle with a cold, vice-like grip.
James!
Emily screamed as she was yanked off her feet, the shadows dragging her across the floor toward the mirror. James spun around, horror flashing in his eyes as he saw Emily being pulled toward the looming darkness. He lunged forward, the crystal stone's light flickering wildly as he tried to fend off the shadows. But the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. The tendrils wrapped tighter around Emily, pulling her closer to the mirror, their grip unrelenting. Desperation clawed at James as he fought to reach her, but the shadows were everywhere, swirling around him, blocking his path. The stone's light was fading, the darkness closing in. He knew he had only one chance, one last desperate move. With a surge of determination, James gripped the crystal stone tightly, his eyes locked on the mirror. The shadows swirled with renewed fury, as if sensing his intent, but James didn't hesitate. With all his strength, he hurled the stone directly at the mirror, praying it would hit its mark. The stone sailed through the air, glowing with a final, bright flash of light before it struck the mirror dead center. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The mirror's surface rippled like water, the shadows freezing in place. Then, with a deafening crack, the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound echoing through the house like a thunderclap. The stone burst apart on impact, its fragments scattering across the floor, mingling with the shards of the broken mirror. The shadows recoiled, their dark tendrils snapping back as if burned. The darkness that had filled the house seemed to evaporate, retreating with a low, mournful wail as it was pulled back into the shattered remains of the mirror. Emily fell to the floor as the grip of the shadows released her, gasping for breath as she crawled away from the mirror's remains. James was by her side in an instant, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her to safety. The house was suddenly, eerily still. The oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a calm, almost serene silence. The walls no longer shifted, the furniture no longer moved. The house had returned to its original, if dilapidated, state.
It's over?
James whispered, his voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief.
The mirror, it's gone.
Emily nodded, her body trembling as she clung to him, the terror of the last few minutes still fresh in her mind. But as she looked around, she realized that the nightmare was truly over. The shadows were gone, the mirror was shattered, and the house was once again just a house, a relic of the past, with no more power over them. With shaky legs, they helped each other up, their hands still clasped tightly together. Slowly, they made their way back through the house, down the now ordinary hallway, and toward the front door. When James reached out and turned the handle, it gave way easily, swinging open to reveal the cool, crisp air of the night outside. They stepped out onto the steps, the weight of the house lifting from their shoulders as they breathed in the fresh air. The night was peaceful, the stars twinkling above them, as if the world outside had been untouched by the horrors they had just endured. As they walked away from Briarwood Manor, leaving the dark memories behind, Emily glanced back one last time. The house stood silent and still, its dark windows reflecting the moonlight. A place that had once held so much promise, but had instead been a vessel for something dark and twisted. But now, it was just an old, empty mansion. James squeezed her hand, and she turned to him, a small, relieved smile tugging at her lips. They had faced the darkness together, and they had won. The mirror was shattered, the spirit destroyed, and they were finally free. Without another word, they turned away from the house, walking together into the night, leaving the horrors of Briarwood Manor far behind. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Briarwood Manor. The darkness within has been vanquished, but the echoes of its terror will linger in our minds for some time to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to WispHollow Tales. There's always another story waiting to be told, and who knows what other secrets lurk in the shadows, just waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay curious and beware the darkness.